Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you all for being here. Good afternoon. I hope we're still awake and paying attention. So first of all, I have to say, Daphne, I feel like you narrated a chapter of my life because I was recently at the U.S. mission to the UN negotiating Resolution 2396 and helping to draft it. So I feel like you encapsulated all of my feelings there. But good afternoon. My name is Emerita Torres. I'm the Director of Programs at the Sufan Center. We are a resource and forum for research analysis and strategic dialogue, and foreign terrorist fighters. And this issue is of imperative importance to us. I'll start off by sharing that our center's founder, Ali Sufan, recently co-wrote an open letter to Western governments yesterday on the anniversary of 9/11, warning that the conditions that gave rise to the September 11th attacks are resurfacing again in Iraq and Syria, and the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are not diminishing, but growing in strength. So I'll open with that. The title is, and I hope you look it up, "Unless We Act Now, the Islamic State Will Rise Again," calls attention to the growing foreign terrorist fighter concerns associated with the current situation. The letter warns about the long-term security repercussions of leaving populations formerly affiliated with the Islamic State, as we've discussed, men, women, and children, in legal and political limbo in camps and prisons in the region. It urges states to recognize that the way that we treat these populations today will have a direct impact on our global security in the future. So I'll just go through some of the main points, which many of have been discussed already. But first, ISIS is not defeated; it is covert, gaining strength with safe havens. So, just to give you a bit of background where we are today. While the Islamic State's caliphate may have been defeated in the physical sense, Baghouz here in red, following its fall in March of this year, the threat is by no means over. A recent Inspector General's report from the U.S. Department of State on Operation Inherent Resolve concluded that the Islamic State is resurging in Syria and solidifying its capabilities for insurgency in Iraq. And you can see some of the gray areas. This is where ISIS remnants are. So you see al-Raqqa, you'll see in Al-Qam, you'll see elsewhere throughout Syria and Iraq. Particularly, yes, Fallujah, Kirkuk, and Raqqa in Iraq, as well as in Raqqa and Idlib in Syria. The map clearly shows that ISIS is not defeated. It is still conducting attacks, collecting revenue post-March 2019, just as a more clandestine network. Just in March, ISIS executed several Iraqis from Raqqa, and its residual wealth is estimated at up to $300 million. So it's hard to call this group defeated. Next slide, going to safe havens. So ISIS still has many safe havens around the world. This slide highlights the branches or affiliate networks of ISIS and Al-Qaeda that we are aware of exist today. ISIS has branches from Nigeria to Afghanistan and from Somalia to the Philippines, 15 in total. ISIL's West Africa province is among its strongest affiliates, and in Asia, ISIS has between 2,500 and 4,000 fighters. So again, although ISIS is no longer a caliphate, a physical caliphate, that doesn't mean it doesn't have influence or power around the world. These affiliates are also a breeding ground for young men and women in countries on the margins of their societies. This proliferation of international branches of ISIS make it easier for FTFs, foreign terrorist fighters, to find safe haven elsewhere, especially if they are not being duly prosecuted or if they're being deemed stateless, which is happening right now, as we've already heard. So I'm going to talk, and I know we discussed already Al-Hol, the IDP camp, the detainee camp in northeast Syria, but this is really the next breeding ground for ISIS. For the next caliphate as we see it. According to the latest report from OCHA, which is where these numbers come from, in August 2019, there are about 68,000 people who are detained in the camp, 94% of whom are women and children, and 67% of whom are under 18 years of age. So really a lot of children, and the vast majority, as well as was raised before, many women. The vast majority of detainees in Al-Hol have ties to the Islamic State. Most detainees are from Iraq and Syria, as we see. But there are thousands of Western fighters and their families that remain in detention there. And the majority of these detainees are not terrorists, they are children. And all of them are susceptible to radicalization. But beyond the figures, the conditions there are apocalyptic, as described by the Red Cross. Children routinely die of malnutrition and hypothermia. Education, medical care, and trauma counseling are practically non-existent, and smuggling, ISIS propaganda videos, and violence are all present in this camp. So the demographics and the maltreatment in Al-Hol there make it a breeding ground for ISIS. The group is actively using this camp as an incubator for future recruits. Turning back to fighters from the West in this camp, most of their governments, as we've discussed throughout this panel, have refused to take them back, which is another major problem. Some governments have even revoked their citizenship. Others have called for an international tribunal, which amounts to another means, in our view, of avoiding the tough but necessary responsibility of dealing with their own citizens. Which brings me to my next point. International consensus on FTFs doesn't exist. I think that's an obvious one. Western countries, in particular in Europe, have largely refused to take back their citizens, and in some cases have even stripped their citizenship, citing legal and prosecutorial difficulties with obtaining evidence, for example. But stripping citizenship is the abdication of a sovereign state's responsibility and is against international law. But many believe that by blocking the return of these dangerous extremists, they are protecting their citizens at home. So it's a political issue, right? And while their fear is understandable, it is still the wrong choice for several reasons. This hands-off stance will only create greater danger in the future. The deplorable conditions of local camps and detention centers like Al-Hol fuel the narrative of grievance and revenge that has proven so potent for the Islamic State in its recruiting efforts. The denial of citizenship by their home nations will only bolster their sense of being and, in effect, create new citizens of the Islamic State, potentially preparing them to form the core of a future resurgence. Leaving FTFs to be prosecuted locally also puts an undue burden on the war-torn country, Iraq, that does not have the resources or level of due process that would allow for fair and just trials. Furthermore, local prisons are underfunded, overcrowded, and fertile for ISIS recruitment. Coordinating and cooperating internationally on judicial issues and prosecution is not a new concept. I know this, I've spent time at the United Nations. The UN Security Council, for example, has several resolutions from Judicial Cooperation 2396 and 2178 that talk about international cooperation along legal and judicial lines. So this is possible. It's not easy, but it's certainly possible. Very recently, as was discussed, the EU announced a common database among its member states, which is a good start, but it's simply not enough. We need a sense of urgency and political will. It is our view, again, that countries must take their citizens back, prosecute them, and develop rehabilitation and reintegration programs to break the cycle of terrorism. If we don't invest in providing fair trials and justice at home and keeping hardened terrorists behind bars while working towards rehabilitating and reintegrating those that can be, we are only perpetuating this problem. Prosecuting fighters at home is also an opportunity for us to dismantle the narrative of the rebel fighter. By putting these men and women through the democratic judicial processes of their home countries, we show the world who they truly are, criminals. We can also create a counter-narrative by creating de-radicalization programs in and outside of prisons, along with adequate psychological and social support for the children returning from these conflict zones. These formerly radicalized people could later become the spokespeople we need who can deter future generations from the rallying calls of violent extremism. Finally, some countries, particularly in the West, are pushing for an international tribunal to investigate and prosecute ISIS fighters, as we discussed. The tribunal would be modeled on international hybrid tribunals, such as those created to address the genocides in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. An international court, in our view, is a self-serving way for European countries to keep suspected ISIS members from returning home. Setting up such mechanisms, they're complicated, costly, and bureaucratic, and justice could take decades to be delivered, if at all, as we've seen from the previous tribunals. Further, Iraq is already overburdened, and so to expect it to create an entirely new international system is just unrealistic. So where do we go from here? As I mentioned, really my bottom line is we will pay the price, whether we pay it today, tomorrow, the next day, to address the cycle of terrorism. We have the choice of investing now, investing in rehabilitation and reintegration programs, de-radicalization and prosecution programs, or pay a much higher price if we ignore it. We must begin by implementing these rehabilitation programs, both in and out of prisons. And for many of those radicalized, it's important to note that some of them never felt like they were a part of their society to begin with. This is something that must be kept in mind with program design and implementation. And while we have international guidance and UN Security Council resolutions on addressing foreign terrorist fighters, I believe, and I negotiated this resolution, 2396, that it does fall short when it comes to prescribing how states should take responsibility for their citizens upon return. If we continue to deem fighters stateless, it makes me beg the question of whether we need a follow-up to this resolution. To close, the solution to defeating ISIS and other terrorist groups are not solely military in nature. We see this with the fall of the physical caliphate of ISIS, but we also see it as it resurges. The dynamics that allow the Islamic State to exist in the first place are very much alive and well. So only by defeating the conditions that allow the appeal of the Islamic State narrative can we fight against it and win. Thank you.